Brianna Keller was supposed to be home by nightfall. That was the only plan. Nothing dramatic. Nothing risky. Just a simple drive that had already been made 100 times before. The kind of drive no one marks on a calendar. The kind that doesn't feel like a beginning, but by the time the sky darkened and her phone stayed silent, something had already gone wrong. Brianna Keller didn't vanish in a moment of chaos. She didn't leave behind a crime scene. There was no struggle, no alarm, no goodbye. She simply failed to arrive. And in that quiet gap between expectation and absence, a nightmare opened that her family would live inside for years. Brianna wasn't a mystery when people spoke about her. She was familiar, recognizable, the kind of person whose life was built from routines and small connections. She kept in touch. She answered messages. She showed up when she said she would. Someone always knew where she was supposed to be. That night, someone was waiting, and Brianna didn't come. At first, it felt like inconvenience, a delayed stop, a dead phone, the kind of thing people laugh about later. Her family checked their messages. They checked the roads she usually took. They waited for the vibration of a call that would explain everything in one sentence. It never came. Hours passed. Then more calls. Then the realization that no one had actually seen her arrive anywhere. That there was no confirmation of where her day had ended. Only the knowledge of where it had started. By the time her name was spoken to police, Brianna Keller was no longer late. She was missing. Officers began with what always comes first: the last known movements, where she was going, who she spoke to, what she was wearing, what she was driving. They traced the ordinary shape of her day, trying to find where it broke. Her car became central immediately. It was the one object that moved when she did, the one thing that should have left a trail. Cameras, toll points, parking lots. Somewhere it should have appeared. It didn't. Roads were driven, shoulders were scanned, ditches, pull-offs, rest areas, empty lots. The places where stalled vehicles announce themselves. The places where mistakes usually leave evidence. There was nothing, no debris, no skid marks, no abandoned car. It was as if Brianna and everything she was inside had been lifted out of the landscape without disturbing it. What unsettled investigators was not what they found. It was what they couldn't. Her phone activity stopped without warning. Not gradually. Not after a long pause. One moment it existed within the network of daily life. The next, it didn't. No pings drifting away. No movement across towers. No final call placed in distress. Just silence. For her family, the waiting changed shape. It stopped being about traffic or errands or misunderstandings. It became about geography, about routes, about the spaces between places. They began to look at maps differently, to trace lines with their fingers, to imagine where a car could go without being seen. Every possible road was considered, every familiar shortcut, every turn Brianna might have taken without thinking. And slowly, another possibility began to sit in the room with them. One that didn't leave broken glass on asphalt. One that didn't leave anything visible at all. Water. The region around Brianna's route was threaded with it. Small lakes, retention ponds, quarries, old pits filled by rain and time, places that reflected the sky so cleanly they looked empty, places drivers passed without noticing because they had always been there. Search teams would eventually bring boats, divers, equipment meant to look beneath surfaces. But in the first hours, then the first days, water was only one idea among many. And Brianna Keller was still, somehow, expected to walk back into her life. She didn't. And with each sunrise that passed without her, the question narrowed. Not who she was, not where she meant to go, but where, in all that open, ordinary land, a person and a car could disappear together without a sound. The early investigation moved the way most missing person cases do, outward. Officers started where Brianna Keller's day was known. They retraced her planned route. They contacted the last people who had spoken to her. They pulled records that mapped her ordinary life. Phone logs, recent messages, purchases, digital footprints that usually sketch a person's movement with precision. But Brianna's day refused to draw a straight line. No one could place her beyond a certain point. There was no camera image of her car passing a familiar intersection. No confirmed sighting at a store or gas station. The normal breadcrumbs that modern life scatters behind it simply stopped. Investigators canvassed neighborhoods along the route she was believed to be taking. They spoke to homeowners, shop clerks, delivery drivers, anyone who spent their days watching roads. No one recalled seeing her. No one remembered a stalled vehicle. No one remembered an accident. What made this absence troubling was not just that Brianna was gone. It was that her disappearance had not interrupted anything. Traffic had not backed up. Emergency calls had not come in. There was no moment when the world had reacted to her vanishing. Whatever happened to her happened without witnesses, or happened somewhere no one was looking. Her family joined the search almost immediately. They drove the roads themselves, slower than traffic, eyes drawn to shoulders and tree lines, scanning for a glint of metal or an unfamiliar shape. They checked places Brianna sometimes pulled over. They checked places she never did. They checked because not checking felt worse. Posters went up. Her photo spread across social media. Local news carried her face, her name, her description. Tips arrived. Each one came with a surge of hope and ended with the same quiet collapse. Wrong car. Wrong road. Wrong day. Police began to widen the map. They looked beyond the obvious route. They considered whether Brianna had gone somewhere unexpected, whether she'd stopped for something unplanned, whether she'd met someone, whether she'd turned back. They searched fields, wooded edges, construction zones, drainage areas, places where vehicles sometimes leave the road and are found because something visible breaks. Still nothing. The problem investigators faced was structural. Brianna hadn't left behind an event. She had left behind an absence, and absence is difficult to organize. Without a confirmed crash site, there was nowhere to focus heavy resources. Without debris or witnesses, there was no reason to believe she'd been in trouble at any particular point. Every mile of road became equally possible. Every turn equally important. Every theory equally thin. Water, however, kept returning to the conversations, not urgently, not dramatically, just persistently. There were bodies of water near portions of her likely route, some close enough that a moment of inattention could have sent a car beyond the pavement, others farther out, connected by smaller roads and shortcuts people used without thinking. The challenge was scale. Water does not announce itself when it takes something. It does not scatter evidence across lanes. It does not leave broken signs or bent guardrails every time. Sometimes it only closes. Search teams did conduct water checks. Divers entered some of the more obvious locations. Boats traced shorelines. Sonar was used in selected spots where depth or history suggested risk. But water is not one place. It is many. Visibility varied. Some lakes were deep, others choked with vegetation. Some quarry pits were older than local maps. Some retention ponds had no clear access points. Searching them all thoroughly would have required time, equipment, and cause. and investigators still did not know where Brianna had gone off her expected path. As days extended, then weeks, the investigation faced the reality it could not avoid. They were looking for a car with no confirmed direction, and possibly one that had already been swallowed. Her family began to live inside a question. Not only where Brianna was, but how someone could vanish inside a familiar landscape without leaving behind even the smallest mark of having passed through it. By the time the first season changed, the search for Brianna Keller no longer moved with urgency. It moved with maintenance. Her case was still open, her file still active. But without a fixed location, every new effort required justification. Each new dive, each new grid, each new deployment had to answer the same question: why here? And there was never a clear answer. Investigators reviewed what they had again and again. They reconstructed her day from the inside out. Conversations, app data, receipts, the ordinary digital exhaust of a life. They looked for anomalies, detours, interruptions, anything that suggested a moment when Brianna's path had bent. They found none. No argument before she left. No unusual plans. No reason to believe she intended to go anywhere but where she said she was going. The simplicity of her day made it harder, not easier. There was no emotional storm to chart. No risk pattern to trace. Nothing that explained why she would disappear completely between one point and the next. Without new information, the investigation began to narrow in a different way. Not geographically, administratively. Active searches gave way to periodic reviews. Tips were logged and assessed rather than pursued at scale. Detectives who had walked the roads and spoken to the family moved on to other cases, carrying Brianna's name into meetings and briefings, but no longer into the field. Her disappearance did not end. It settled. For her family, time took on a new shape. The frantic early days gave way to something heavier. A routine built around waiting. Around checking messages that rarely came. Around answering the same questions from different people who all wanted to help and none of whom could. They marked milestones that no longer included her. Holidays arrived and passed with her absence occupying the center of every gathering. Her belongings stayed where they had been. Her room, her car keys. The small objects that had not made the drive with her became the last physical proof that she had been real. Occasionally, a new idea would surface. Someone would report a vehicle in a pond. A fisherman would mention something half-seen beneath murky water. A drone image would catch an odd shape. Each time, hope returned carefully. And each time, it left the same way. The region around Brianna's disappearance was defined by stillness. Not dramatic lakes with visible shorelines and open water, but quiet ones. Water that blended into its surroundings. Retention basins bordered by grass. Quarries ringed by trees. Ponds whose surfaces mirrored the sky so precisely they looked empty. Over time, development altered the landscape. Brush thickened. Water levels shifted. Roads were repaved. Shoulders widened. The environment that might once have shown a disturbance slowly erased its own past. If Brianna had entered water somewhere no one witnessed, that water had been working ever since to hide the moment. Years passed without a confirmed sighting, but her case never closed. It stayed suspended in that unresolved space that neither confirms life nor grants death. A place where families learn to hold two realities at once: the need to hope and the need to understand. What investigators did not know was that while they waited for information to arrive, the answer had already been sitting in the open. Not far from where Brianna had last been expected. Not far from where people passed every day. hidden not by distance, but by depth. The discovery did not begin with Brianna Keller's name. It began with a routine, a day like many others, people moving through familiar ground, the kind of ordinary moment that rarely intersects with the past. There was no search operation underway, no renewed investigation. No one was looking for Brianna when something finally broke the surface of her story. It started with a piece of water that had always been there. A lake that sat quietly off a secondary road. Not large, not dramatic, not marked as dangerous. The kind of place locals barely register anymore. Its surface usually calm, its edges softened by time, plants, and silt. A place that reflected clouds more often than it reflected attention. That day, conditions were different. The light hit the water at an angle it rarely did. The surface was unusually clear, and beneath it, something held its shape too cleanly to belong. At first, it was mistaken for debris, a shadow, a submerged structure. But as the water shifted and the view steadied, the geometry became harder to ignore. Straight lines, a curved edge, the unmistakable outline of something made, something mechanical. Authorities were contacted. Officers arrived. They walked the shoreline, looking from above, then from different points. What could be seen was not a wreck, not scattered parts. It was intact. A vehicle sat on the lakebed. It was positioned upright, windows clouded, color muted by years of submersion. The kind of stillness that doesn't suggest an impact, only a descent, a slow surrender to depth. Divers were brought in. Equipment followed. The water was colder below the surface, darker, thick with suspended sediment that rose at the slightest movement. As they descended, the car emerged gradually, not as an object from a crash scene, but as something that had become part of the environment. It had been there long enough for the lake to accept it. The first detail confirmed was the make. Then, the model. Then, inside the vehicle, the outline of a license plate. Once it was cleared enough to read, the investigation that had stalled years earlier found its center again. The number matched. This was Brianna Keller's car. Recovery was slow, not because of difficulty, but because of care. The vehicle was stabilized. Lines were attached. Each movement raised clouds of fine silt that had been undisturbed since the day it settled. As it was lifted, water drained from spaces that had not seen air in years. On the shore, officers stood quietly. No one spoke over the equipment. No one rushed the moment. There was nothing left to chase, only something to receive. When the car broke the surface, its shape looked wrong in open air. Heavy, aged, a private space made public. A place that had held time. Inside was Brianna. Her presence confirmed what everyone had begun to understand the moment the plate was read. She had not disappeared into people. She had disappeared into the landscape. Investigators began reconstructing what likely happened. The road near the lake curved gently. There were no strong barriers. At night, or in poor visibility, the waterline blended into darkness. A moment of distraction. A wrong angle. A drift beyond pavement. There was no evidence of involvement by another person. No signs of struggle. No indications of anything but an unobserved departure from the road, and a quiet entry into water that closed above her. What had been missing all those years was not motive. It was location. And location had been waiting. The truth did not arrive with relief. It arrived with weight. When Brianna Keller's car was secured and forensics began their work, the long unanswered questions finally narrowed into one. Not where she was, not whether she would be found, but how to live with the answer. Examiners confirmed what the scene already suggested. There was no evidence of foul play, no damage consistent with pursuit, no signs that anyone else had been involved. Brianna's death was ruled an accident, a single moment on an ordinary road that quietly redirected the rest of her life into silence. The lake had done what water always does. It closed. Investigators traced her likely path again, this time with the destination known, the angle of entry, the condition of the roadway, the absence of barriers, the way headlights at night could flatten distance, making the water appear like more road. What once felt impossible now fit into place with cruel simplicity. There had been no dramatic disappearance, only an unobserved one. For Brianna's family, the discovery ended one nightmare and began another. The years of not knowing were over. The years of imagining were finished. In their place was something heavier, but more solid. A truth they could finally hold. A place they could finally visit. A moment they could finally grieve. They were able to bring her home, to speak her name without a question mark attached to it, to mourn without waiting. The case file was closed, but her story did not end with recovery paperwork and official language. It lived on in the details that had once seemed meaningless: the normal drive, the missed arrival, the quiet phone, the stretch of water people passed every day without looking. Brianna Keller had not vanished from the world. She had remained in it, hidden by the very stillness of it. And now, her name no longer belongs to a search. It belongs to a memory. If this story held you, if Brianna's journey made you pause and picture someone you love, then take a moment to be part of what keeps these names alive. Like this video so these stories can keep reaching the people who need to hear them. Subscribe and walk with us as we uncover the lives the world almost lost. And in the comments, tell us something simple but human. Where were you the last time you made an ordinary drive you'll never forget? Because every story begins in a normal moment, and every person deserves to be remembered long after it ends.